Sling and Things.
Sup, and welcome to Sling and Things. A few weeks ago, I was scrounging for something to watch when I spotted the O.J. Simpson 30 for 30 special. And I'd seen it before, and I knew that it was very long, but I figured, well, I'll put it on for a few minutes while I try to figure out what I really want to watch. I had no intention of seeing the whole thing again. So I put it on, and 10 minutes passed, and 30 minutes passed, and an hour passed. Before I knew it, I was rewatching the entire thing. I got sucked back into it. And since I found myself rewatching this, I figured I might as well just review it, since if nothing else, it is absolutely worth talking about. Today I am reviewing O.J. Made in America, which was directed by Ezra Edelman and which was produced by ESPN Films as part of their 30 for 30 series. O.J. Made in America is a very long documentary, so long that it stretches the definition of even being considered a documentary. But regardless of what you want to call it, it is a 5-part miniseries, or movie, that lasts a total of 7 hours and 47 minutes. And when I say that this is nearly 8 hours long, I imagine that the first thought that pops into your head is, ooh, is it worth it? Is this worth committing 8 hours to? Because it's a pretty big investment. Well, not only is O.J. Made in America worth it, it could have been longer. This was some of the quickest 8 hours of entertainment I've ever binged, and it's largely because few people on Earth have lived a more, to put it mildly, interesting life than O.J. Simpson, who went from a poor kid living in the projects to one of the greatest football players ever, to an actor, to a broadcaster, to an accused murderer, to one of the most disgraced, infamous personalities in American pop culture history, and then finally to a convicted criminal. And this documentary comprehensively covers his life story up to about a year before he was released from prison. What separates O.J. Made in America from most documentaries, what makes it special, is that it devotes a hefty chunk of its runtime to explain the circumstances around its subject matter, which is kind of a risky thing to do when you consider that, it adds to the runtime. O.J. Simpson's murder trial was maybe the most famous court case of the 20th century, and the fact that he was acquitted and that he was widely supported by African Americans at the time was baffling to white people. It didn't make sense to them how this guy who almost unquestionably murdered 2 people could become a cultural hero. And what O.J. Made in America does is it contextualizes his trial with the history of racism and police brutality in Los Angeles, and it explains how all the major racial incidents prior to O.J.'s had not gone in the victim's favor. This documentary implicitly makes the case that O.J. Simpson would not have gotten away with murder if not for all the racist abuse cases that had preceded his, which had set the stage for a jury to find him, or someone like him, innocent as retribution for those previous cases. In fact, one of the jurors from his trial flat out says in the documentary that her acquittal vote was payback for the Rodney King beating. And the documentary takes its time to explain what the Rodney King beating was, and what the Watts riots were, and what the 92 LA riots were, and who Latasha Harlins was, and who Eula Love was, and how all of those incidents built up to the O.J. trial and made it as immense as it was. It acknowledges what many documentaries either don't do or don't have the luxury of doing, which is that crazy events like this don't just happen in a vacuum. They happen because they're the culmination of other crazy historical events that made it possible for it to occur in the first place, even if there's no direct connection to it at first glance. In the same way that Donald Trump, for example, would not have been elected president if not for 70 different factors that all circumstantially aligned in his favor, O.J. Simpson would not have gotten away with murder had he not spent his life threading the needle on race in such a way that it set him up as maybe the only black person in America who could do what he did, when he did it, how he did it, and get away with it. And this documentary tries to piece together how that all happened, and how this man's life is ultimately defined by race, even as someone who spent most of that life trying to defy his ethnicity. One thing the documentary makes perfectly clear, too, is that O.J. Simpson absolutely murdered his ex-wife and one of her friends. For all the nuance and layers that are worth exploring about Simpson, whether or not he killed Nicole Brown is not one of them, because the sheer amount of evidence that points towards him doing it is overwhelming to an almost unbelievable degree. And what's interesting is, when I grew up, I didn't know anything about OJ other than that he was this notorious killer. I didn't even know that he was a football player. I was shocked when I found out that he had been an NFL running back too. But one thing I remember is that for a few years, it was socially acceptable to state that you thought that maybe he was innocent, because that's how bad the LAPD's reputation was at the time. You could think that, maybe they tried to frame him or something. And then OJ wrote this book called If I Did It, about how he would have hypothetically murdered his ex-wife if he had done it. And once he wrote that, I remember any presumption that he might have been innocent came to a complete stop. And it just sank into everyone that, wow, he really did kill those people. Because only a total monster would write that book. No one who was seriously grieving the loss of their ex-wife would ever write something as gross as that. It's unconscionable. And it's what makes O.J. Simpson an awful, fascinating character, because he is the rare person who beat the system, who many people wanted to beat the system, who didn't deserve to. Made in America is expertly well made. Ezra Edelman did an amazing job at assembling a narrative out of all of these interviews that he conducted with people who had connections to Simpson, all of whom are very interesting. And it's impressive not just because of how long it is, but because it doesn't feature a narrator or a ton of text on the screen that you have to read. This is a very seamless production, and even though it doesn't feature an original sit-down with Simpson, who again was in a penitentiary when this came out, it includes so much archival footage of him that you never feel like his perspective is absent. Another thing Made in America has going for it is its score, which is sensational. Documentaries don't always get original scores. A lot of them have to rely on production music, and that's especially true if you look at the 30 for 30 films that preceded this. But not this one. Made in America received a score by a composer named Gary Leonelli that is beautiful and haunting and tragic. It's a soundtrack that you could justifiably listen to and appreciate purely as a collection of music, even if you isolated it from this project. The score is that good, and it gives the entire production an engrossing cinematic feel. Some of the scenes in this are so tense and riveting that you forget you're watching a documentary. It creates an emotional resonance that only the very best pieces of entertainment are able to tap into. And it's why this is one of the best documentary movies ever, if it even is a movie, because, hey, this won both an Oscar and an Emmy. So, who's to say? Made in America really is fantastic, and any criticisms I have about it are ones that don't detract from it being fantastic. But there is one notable omission to this documentary, and I'm actually going to cite a New York Times critic here who wrote something when this came out that I happen to agree with. This isn't something I normally do. I actually try to avoid reading other people's reviews before I make my own review out of fear that I'll accidentally, copy them without realizing it. But I feel like I should give DAP here because I remember agreeing with this at the time. This is from A.O. Scott. It is hard not to notice the predominance of male voices among the interview subjects and the narrowness of the film's discussion of domestic violence. This is not to say that the issue is ignored. Mr. Simpson's history of abusing Nicole is extensively and graphically documented, as is the fact that most of his friends ignored what was going on at the Rockingham estate. But the film, which so persuasively treats law enforcement racism as a systemic problem, can't figure out how to treat violence against women with the same kind of rigor or nuance. The deep links between misogyny and American sports culture remain unexamined. This is a significant blind spot. And it is. O.J. Made in America focuses on so many of the multitudes that surrounded Simpson, like how racism affected him, and how being rich affected him, and how being a celebrity affected him, and how even homophobia affected him. And yet, it never really delves into how sexism affected him and the trial, when it undoubtedly played a seismic role in his life story. Like the fact that so many of his associates knew that he was hitting his wife and still maintained their friendship with him is just staggering in retrospect. Like, you listen to his friends in this casually recall how much he assaulted Nicole and how much he cheated on her and how much he abused her, and it's surreal to think that this was acceptable to them, that they didn't have a problem having a friend who was doing all this to someone. The OJ story, to me, is as much an indictment about how misogynistic America was as it is about how racist America was. The two are not mutually exclusive. But the prior perspective is never vocalized when it needed to be. We should have heard from more women who knew Nicole, from people who could have attested to how trapped and powerless she felt, and how little support she had in spite of everything that was happening to her, and how her story isn't an unusual one either. The truth is that O.J. Simpson should have gone to jail long before he murdered her, and that had the criminal justice system been fairer to women in the same way it should have been fairer to black people, Nicole Brown's murder could have been avoided. And the documentary doesn't note that, which is a missed opportunity. And had this movie come out just a couple years later, after Trump had been elected president and after the Me Too movement had been solidified, I think this documentary would have looked a little different. I think it would have featured more female voices, and I think it would have been better for it. As it is, though, O.J. Made in America is still a masterpiece. It is powerful, it is enraging, it's disturbing, and I would be remiss if I did not note that if you see this, you will see graphic imagery of the victims' bodies in this documentary, and that is something you should prepare yourself for. If you watch this documentary, you will need to decompress from it, because it is upsetting for a number of reasons. And yet, it is definitely worth seeing. It is educational about topics beyond O.J. Simpson, and I feel smarter for having watched it. It is one of the best things ESPN has ever produced. And if you're like me, if you have been privileged enough to have not have had to personally deal with racism, and if you're looking to rectify that blind spot so that you can be a better ally to those who do, watching something like this can't hurt.